Let's talk about James Bond. So James Bond has been slapped with a trigger warning. Anyone who attends the new BFI season of Bond will learn that these films contain ideas and language that are of their time, shall we say. Simon, you wrote a really great column on this week. I mean, what have you made of it?
Well, it was interesting that a few people came forward and said, there are elements in those Bond films that are not acceptable nowadays, and possibly, because we've all sort of grown up with them, we have learned to take them with a pinch of salt. But if they're trying to attract young people to the cinema and they see James Bond, some people say very, very close to raping Pussy Galore in order to cure her of her lesbianism, that might be quite... I can understand that. I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit. I think what it is, as time goes on, there is a huge difference between those of us who have gradually learned to accommodate some of the more dated attitudes that appear in movies like that, and some people who might be encountering old stuff for the first time. The season, I think, was actually intended to celebrate the career of the composer, John Barry, who created a lot of the most famous scores for Bond movies, and there are a few other films in there as well. I think the Ipcress File and possibly some other Michael Caine stuff as well. And it's quite interesting in that regard, because John Barry's scores, which I love, I have a couple of CDs of his soundtracks, are emblematic of a certain kind of, excitement about the sexual revolution at the time. And in a way, they are more emphatically dated, but I would say preferable to the kind of extraordinarily kind of grotesque musical displays that come out of, American R&B and hip-hop and so on now. And yet seem to require no sort of trigger warning at all. The kind of YouTube videos that really are very close to pornography and so on, both in their visual and lyrical content. Whereas John Barry's stuff, which, as I say, I think is the linking sort of principle in these movies, is incredibly sort of naive and upbeat and just swinging, baby. It's Austin Powers, but it's I do worry, as I said in the article, there is. I understand why some people might look at it and go, mate, if you don't care about trigger warnings, just let it wash over you. It's 3 seconds on the screen before the movie starts. And I understand why people might think I'm just being a harumphing old bore about it. But as I said in the article, the worry is that the more we bend over to try and accommodate people's vulnerability, weakness, mental fragility, the more fragile they become. That all the evidence supports that concern, that we have raised a couple of generations now, who were not allowed to play outside, who were not allowed to form gangs, who were not allowed to play doctors and nurses, who have been sort of raised almost in laboratory conditions, and it's not looking great at the moment, to be honest. As an experiment, you would probably say it's failed in that particular respect, and perhaps we need to start exposing them to the sort of impacts that would actually help their immune system to grow again.
The assumption behind these trigger warnings is that you will absolutely be offended by this, and you need to steel yourself before you see James Bond, doing a Chinese impression or whatever it is. Yeah. We can all agree that there are some choice moments in those films, but are they likely to precipitate a mental health episode?
And why does it matter in the grand scheme of things? I think it's something that you might remark upon in a kind of film studies lesson, or a younger member of your family might recoil slightly at some of the language used, but it really wouldn't previously have gone much further than that, because these things shouldn't ultimately matter too much. But I think what you're saying there, Fraser, points to one of the reasons why it is worth taking these things up, because on the one hand, these trigger warnings, yes, they are fleeting. What difference does it make? They do hold the entire audience in contempt to some degree. If you very much kind of casting, particularly young people, they seem to be aimed at as so fragile that they can't even engage with a piece of culture that was produced, longer than 5 years ago. That's very irritating. I think the other thing about these trigger warnings and the fact that they're being slapped on films, increasingly books and novels. I mean, there was a kind of spate of stories recently about, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse getting a trigger warning about it might reflect attitudes that are no longer acceptable today, given that it's a novel about kind of an upper crust family going on their holidays. It does, there's not a hell of a lot in there. It's not like they suddenly black up halfway through it, but nevertheless that was put on there. I think this thing that you increasingly see happening with culture, and I think particularly when it happens to popular culture of a certain vintage, I think another reason it grates on people is because there's this kind of implied contemptuous attitude to the sorts of things that people who are still bopping around, not necessarily that old, culture that they also enjoyed.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of this, these trigger warnings and the kind of the standing in judgment, stern judgment of something like a James Bond film from 30 or 40 years ago, I think people are also interpreting it as part of that broader kind of cultural condescension against people and for the things that they like and for the TV and the films that they used to enjoy and so on. So I think that there are reasons to oppose it, but also, as Simon said, the fundamental thing is it's obviously having the opposite effect. If these things are supposedly to protect against vulnerability and fragility amongst the population, it's clearly feeding it. I mean, trigger warnings were always supposed to be, when they were first sort of came up with and you'd see them crop up on university campuses, it was very specifically supposed to be about people with PTSD or something.
Yeah.
And even on those terms, various psychologists have pointed out it fails because you shouldn't kind of wrap someone in cotton wool to try and protect them from their own particular actual triggers. But the fact that that's now been extrapolated to all of society is obviously having the effect that you're talking about, Simon. So if that's the point of it, which is to make sure that people aren't... that we don't have this kind of society in which people fly off the handle, is having the completely opposite effect.
Can I just add something as well that's occurring to me, listening to you talk, and I think is absolutely right, but it's interesting, we're having a sort of quasi-academic discussion about it, and I think that's the tone these things set, isn't it? And it's almost unthinkable, even if young people did want to go along to the BFI to watch a Bond movie or one of the other Barry movies and just enjoy it and sink into that experience, the very fact that there are trigger warnings at the beginning almost precludes the possibility of them just sitting back and enjoying it, let alone laughing out loud or feeling some excitement. They're more expected to treat it as if they're visiting a gallery and looking at some photojournalism from Biafra or something. You can't, they're looking at one of the horrors of the 60s, one of the terrible, artifacts of unreconstructed masculinity before we got a handle on it. And that's a terrible shame, They should be celebrating the music, the fashion, the devil-may-care attitudes. But anyone who laughed out loud, it's just similar, I know as a comedian, of course, as soon as you create the possibility that other people in the room might be offended, that's it, it's over. You cannot enjoy the thing.
Yeah, and I think, trigger warnings are not in a censorship in and of themselves, but they do also create a climate of censorship. I mean, I almost think they're a little bit like on those maps where you see "Here be dragons." Don't go there. This is dangerous. And we've also seen a similar phenomenon with older text, is the sort of rewriting by sensitivity readers. These phenomena are all of a piece, even if trigger warnings are not directly censorious.
No, definitely. I think Simon described it so well as well. It becomes this kind of obstacle between you and the artwork, or a kind of barrier between you and what it is that you're supposed to actually be engaging in. And it casts it in a kind of suspicious light. It suggests, as you were saying there, Simon, that at best it's a kind of artifact of some bigotry that we should just examine and learn from rather than actually enjoy in any meaningful sense. And I think it is bound up with a general kind of discomfort, not just with the potential of art and literature to shock or whatever, but also just this profound discomfort we have even with the relatively recent past. These trigger warnings, it's seemingly kind of slapped on anything that wasn't made 5 minutes ago. And just seems to be that any kind of scant reminder of an era in which whether the topics that might be discussed, the kind of stereotypes that might be being bandied around, some of just the language maybe being used, a lack of representation or diversity as is currently being talked about, is so toxic and corrupting that you need to be, if not insulated from it completely, at least heavily warned about. I think just speaks to that real discomfort with any kind of vestige of how society used to be. And it's just odd because this sense that the bad old days, it now seems to reach up until at least the 2000s. And that's a recent development, it feels like.
That was when Russell Brand was rampaging around.
No, exactly. There was a lot of articles around that. Maybe I didn't realise it reached that far. But as you're saying, Simon, culturally and historically, young people in particular are being encouraged to believe that there's nothing salvageable or enjoyable whatsoever from before then. And considering the kind of cultural and to a certain extent political wasteland we've been living in for quite some time, that's a very strange attitude to adopt, I think.
I mean, you see it a lot. There's a conversation going on at the moment about between Joey Barton and the rest of the world of football about whether or not female commentators know what they're talking about and so on. Now, I don't really follow football and I don't have any well-informed view on that. And I know some people who are keen on football, men who are fine with the female commentators. So I'm not sort of saying it's, it's a slam dunk case. But there is, again, an attempt to present a view that he has that's a slightly old-fashioned attitude towards the thing as deranged. I mean, I have literally seen that word used in The Guardian. There's a guy called Jonathan Yu or something, Liu, I think his name is, who wrote a column about Barton's ranting on Twitter about these women, saying that his, incoherent, as if he was foaming at the mouth, whereas really he has a view which was completely normal not very long ago, which is that men's football should be commentated on by men, and I suspect there are millions of men who still hold to that view. And there's a similar thing with the Bond movies, that they represent a worldview which was pretty predominant, or at least a slightly lurid version of it, but the underpinning sensibilities were there, that there are, that it is a dream that most men have to be given an Aston Martin and a snug-nosed little pistol and a license to use it without application for authority. And to go out and traverse 5 continents and solve the world's problems. This is a fantasy that it was pretty universal until very, very recently. And we're now really anxious, I think, about even having any more James Bond movies, even within the constraints that were applied by, hiring Fleabag and having all sorts of, subplots concerning familial responsibility and so on in the last ridiculously intertwined 5 episodes. I think that's kind of sad. And it is only, of course, it always has to be said, but it is only the artistic and cultural artifacts of the West that are being treated this way. Nobody is going to give you a trigger warning before you read some South American literature or even ancient Greek, or Chinese, or the various animations that are popular in the Far East. These are all still considered to have their own code and to be, entitled to pursue those beliefs with freedom, whereas the evil West is beyond redemption.